In 1960, it took the average person about 5 years to move through school, a first job, marriage, and a first child. Today, that same transition takes closer to 20. That's not a slight delay. That's not a generation being lazy, or scared, or entitled, the words you'll hear thrown at them constantly. That's an entirely different shape of life, and almost nobody stops to ask why the shape itself changed. For most of human history, there was no long, blurry middle between being a child and being an adult. In small-scale societies studied by anthropologists, adulthood typically arrived through a specific, often ritualized event, not a gradual unfolding. You were a child. Then, sometimes over a single ceremony, a single hunt, a single marriage arranged by your family, you were not. The line was sharp because life gave you no other option. You needed to work as soon as your body allowed it. You married as soon as it was arranged. You had children because that's what an adult body did next. There was no stage in between where you were technically grown but not yet living like it. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and the line was still fairly sharp, just later. In 1960, the median age for a first marriage in the United States was around 20 for women and 22 for men. Most people had finished their education, found steady work, and started a family, all clustered together in their early 20s. Sociologists call this the Big Three: finishing school, becoming financially independent, and starting a family. For most of the 20th century, these three milestones arrived close together, in a tight cluster, right around the same age. Once you hit them, you were an adult, full stop, no argument, no in-between. Something broke that cluster apart. And it wasn't a change in young people. It was 4 massive structural shifts, and every single one of them happened within a couple of decades of each other. The first was the shift toward a knowledge economy. As manufacturing jobs that required no more than a high school diploma began disappearing, higher education stopped being optional for a stable career and became close to mandatory. People who once entered the workforce at 18 now needed years more of school first, pushing financial independence years further out. The second was the delay in marriage itself. As women gained more access to education and careers, marrying at 20 stopped being the default expectation, and the median age for a first marriage began climbing steadily, decade after decade. The third was a set of changing social norms around premarital independence, sex, and cohabitation, which meant young adults no longer needed marriage as a prerequisite to leave their parents' house or begin an adult-feeling life. You could live independently, date, and build a career, all without checking the marriage box first. And the fourth, perhaps the quietest but most structurally important, was the sheer amount of time now required in education itself, stretching what used to be a few years of schooling into a decade or more for anyone pursuing the credentials the new economy demanded. Put all 4 together, and something strange happened. The Big Three milestones, once clustered tightly around age 22, spread apart. Finishing school might happen at 22. Financial independence might not arrive until 27 or later. Marriage and children might wait until 30, or not happen at all. For the first time in recorded history, there was a long, structurally real gap between no longer being a child and functionally becoming what previous generations understood as an adult. In 2000, a developmental psychologist named Jeffrey Jensen Arnett looked at this gap and did something nobody had done before. He gave it a name: emerging adulthood. Not adolescence. Not young adulthood. A genuinely new developmental stage, roughly ages 18 to 29, that Arnett argued had never existed in this form for any previous generation. Arnett interviewed hundreds of young Americans across ethnicities, regions, and social classes, and found the same 5 characteristics showing up again and again. Identity exploration, a prolonged period of asking who am I, tried out across relationships and jobs rather than settled ones. Instability, in housing, relationships, and career, treated as normal rather than a crisis. Self-focus, a period with fewer obligations to others than at any other point in the lifespan. A persistent feeling of being, in between, neither fully adolescent nor fully adult. And, strangely, optimism, a widespread sense that anything is still possible, that the future hasn't narrowed yet. Here's the part that reframes everything. Arnett wasn't describing a personality trait of one generation. He was describing a structural stage that any generation would experience, if you handed them the same economic and social conditions. Put another way, if you took the exact personalities of people born in 1960 and dropped them into 2026's economy, education requirements, and housing costs, they would very likely show the same, in-between, pattern. Gen Z gets mocked for now. The stage isn't a character flaw. It's what happens to human development when you stretch the distance between childhood and full adult responsibility across an extra decade. But here's where it gets more interesting, because emerging adulthood doesn't look the same everywhere, even among countries with nearly identical economies. Take Japan and South Korea, two of the most affluent, educated societies on Earth. Like Europe and the United States, both countries have seen marriage and parenthood pushed back toward age 30, and both offer young adults substantial support, free university tuition, robust unemployment benefits, systems built to smooth exactly this kind of extended transition. By 2010, in some of the most developed parts of Asia, roughly 90% of men in their early 20s were still unmarried, a figure that would have been almost unthinkable in 1960 anywhere in the industrialized world. And yet the texture of that extended stage looks almost nothing like it does in the West. In the United States and much of Europe, roughly 3 out of 4 young adults report premarital sexual relationships by age 20. In Japan and South Korea, that figure drops to under 1 in 5. Dating itself is often discouraged in these cultures until the late 20s, treated less as casual exploration and more as a serious prelude to marriage. The individualism that defines Western emerging adulthood, focusing on yourself, trying on identities, treating your 20s as a personal laboratory, runs directly against the grain of cultures built on collectivism and family obligation. In other words, the same economic pressures, delayed careers, expensive housing, extended education, produced two very different emotional experiences of the same life stage. One culture responded by turning the gap into a stage of self-focused exploration. Another responded by turning the same gap into a stage of quiet, delayed obligation, still oriented entirely around family, just postponed rather than personalized. The economics created the gap everywhere. The culture decided what to do inside it. Which leaves an uncomfortable question sitting underneath every "why won't they just grow up" headline. There was never anything wrong with waiting to hit developmental milestones later. What's actually strange, historically speaking, is how tightly clustered those milestones used to be, for one specific stretch of the 20th century, under conditions that no longer exist, and no longer exist anywhere in the industrialized world, whether that world responds to the gap with individualism or with obligation. The generation being asked why they haven't caught up isn't behind schedule. They're on a schedule that was never handed to any generation before them, one built by forces entirely outside their control, that simply happened to land in their lifetime. In 1960, it took 5 years to move through the entire shape of adulthood. Today it takes 20, in Tokyo and Seoul just as much as in New York and London, and the people living through those 20 years didn't design the gap. They just happened to be born standing inside it.